Well, so somebody, when I walked outside, asked me, said, well, how's it going? And I said, well, I'm the least qualified person in the room to tell you that, answer that question, but how do you all think it's going? Good? Okay, super. You know, I find it very interesting that we had two panels on two different subjects, and they could not help themselves to have to talk about the subject that we're about ready to discuss. You know, isn't that interesting? The other interesting thing is last night we had a group of people and we did an informal poll about, hey, what is it that concerns you most about our nation's security or international security? And everybody got a chance to vote, and there were a few Russias, a couple Chinas, this and that and the other. The overwhelming majority for 2 years in a row, believe it or not, because we did the same thing last year, is cybersecurity. And that's the subject of this next panel. I want to start by just saying there's a reason we have the problem that we have today. The reason we have the problem is by nature of how our internet originated. You know, it started with this thing called the DARPANET, or ARPANET rather, and the ARPANET was a way to communicate between a small number of people who had common purpose, shared values, and mutual trust. And I'm sure that those original folks could have had no idea how ubiquitous this thing they were creating would become and how important it would become not only to all of our lives, but to pretty much everybody's lives around the world. And so when they did the design, the architecture, everything about it, it was built to be available, open, and completely unregulated, and with no idea that somewhere down the road that there would be unsavory characters wanting to do some things on it that really were harmful. So that's what we have. And so now here we are with a challenge of how do we use this and prevent its use by people who maybe don't have our best interests at heart. So the challenge that we have today, I divide the challenge really into two areas. First is kind of a more technical area, and that is we have these networks, we're very dependent on them. How do we secure them? How do we prevent other people from being able to either interdict or manipulate or somehow make them so they're not useful for us, so that we keep our ability to use this very important tool in order to do things we need to do. But there's a second half of that equation, and that is the content that rides over this system. And now, again, it's an unregulated type of affair, and we have all of this misinformation, manipulation, deception, fake news, whatever you want to call it. We have an issue of all this content and how can you exist with it being completely unregulated, and of course this dilemma, this tension that was brought up by our very first question, and that is how do you somehow balance security and the other opposite end of that, and that's this freedom of expression that we value is part of one of the very basic things that are part of our culture, part of our history. So we're very lucky today to have some distinguished panelists to come join us. First of all, I want to welcome Major General Garrett Yee. His responsibility is the United States Army's network, and I think everybody in this audience for sure would agree that there probably are no more important networks in our country than our military networks, and also probably there are no more attack networks in our country than our military networks. So he has that responsibility for the United States Army. We're very fortunate to have you here today. And then our second panelist we're privileged to have has a different expertise. Dr. Nazli Choucri is a professor of political science with MIT, and her work is in the area of international relations, and of course most notably on sources and consequences of international conflict and violence. And one very important aspect of that is some work that she's led on explorations in cyber and international relations. So We are very, very fortunate to have both of these distinguished panelists join us. And I'd like to start by asking General Yee to have some opening remarks for us to talk about what the Army's approach to this is and maybe some glimpse into the future.
Thanks, General Jones and Dr. Choucri. It's an honor to share the stage with you today. And just, you know, a little bit of, let's get comfortable with Connecticut first. You know, great to be here, and I was here just last month, and I know we have a number of Coast Guard cadets here today, and my wife and I, as we were coming up, you know, through the Connecticut coastline, stayed at the Coast Guard Academy, and just, you know, enjoyed the heck out of that. Now, the reason why I stayed there was, and for the cadets there, I came through the Academy Introduction Mission Program like 30-something years ago at the Coast Guard Academy, so it's kind of nice, 30-something years to revisit the Coast Guard Academy up in New London, or out in New London, I guess. So good to be back in Connecticut within a month, and good to be here at this session, Mike. Let me just give you a little bit of high level, what the Army's doing, and then maybe you can piece together why the network in cybersecurity is important to that. Today, as we speak, we have 178,000 Army soldiers serving combatant commands around the world in over 140 countries as we speak today. And they all rely upon secure communications to do their missions, period, right? So it's got to be secure. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not without challenges and not without being attacked every single day, but they rely on that network to get after that mission. The Army does, the Navy does, the Marines do, the Coast Guard does, the Air Force does, the DoD does. And let me put a finer point on that. So 3 weeks ago, you may have heard of a Staff Sergeant Ron Scherer. He was a medic in 2008 in Afghanistan who just 3 weeks ago got recognized with the Congressional Medal of Honor. And what did he do for that? He was a Special Forces medic in Afghanistan, and as his ODA, his Special Forces team was navigating through a valley, they were pinned down by enemy fire. His team, not a real big team, and the commandos, which were the Afghan partners, were outnumbered by over 200 insurgents. Through the course of that day, Sergeant Scherer, you know, spent up to 7.5 hours under enemy fire, protecting his ODA team as a sole medic, and helping to save at least 4 of his own members of his team and 10 members of the commandos during that time period. Part of what happened that day was he got hit in the helmet, he got wounded in the arm, he had to scale like a 60-foot cliff and bring down 3 of his teammates down off that cliff by, you know, kind of jerry-rigging this nylon webbing to bring those soldiers back down to safety until they got additional support. And for his actions, you know, he received the Silver Star initially, and after a review starting 2 years ago, it was upgraded to the Congressional Medal of Honor. I had the honor to meet him the evening before he was awarded the Medal of Honor, he and his family. What a humble individual. And then to be in the White House the next day, I was there to witness him receiving the Medal of Honor from the President of the United States. But, you know, that is something maybe that we can connect to in some way and know that, wow, there are people out there doing this kind of great work for our nation. But I also say that because we are still a nation at war. And I know that maybe it's hard to feel that, you know, because it's not on our land, not on our territory. But let me tell you, every single day we do have soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in harm's way, getting after the missions that we put them out there for. So this forum, the security forum, is a great venue to kind of remind us, you know, what's happening today and why national security is so important. Last month, in August, 2 months ago in August, we just opened a new 4-star command in the Army. That's huge news. It's the Futures Command, right? And the idea of this 4-star headquarters in Austin, Texas, is to help the Army look forward to future technology and future way of doing business. And we have 6 priorities that the Army's going after: long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicle, future vertical lift, kind of like a helicopter, the network, air and missile defense, and soldier lethality. But here's the thing. All those priorities will require some sort of network connectivity, right? And all those priorities with that network connectivity is going to require some sort of cybersecurity element to that to ensure that whatever we build, that it's secure. So that's the so what about this modernization effort that the Army is going under with a new 4-star command. And let me just say a few things. You know, University of Maryland State from 2017, you know, there's an attack every 39 seconds. There are attacks every single second, but major attacks every 39 seconds. There's been a 200% increase in supply chain attacks and a 600% growth in the Internet of Things attacks, right? Whether it be a Fitbit or Bluetooth enabled, you name it. And over the last month and a half, you know, proven that you can hack a pacemaker, all right? That's kind of an IoT, Internet of Things vulnerability right there. And so the military is under attack every day, and so are we in the civilian sector. And so it's not unique to the military. It's just that, you know, we are, you know, kind of the focus of a lot of international attention. And with that, I'll stop talking, because I know we'll have lots of questions, and I'll hand it back over to you, Mike.
Yeah. Yeah, that comment on the pacemaker thing, I saw a couple of you pick up your phones and start working with it. I don't have a pacemaker. You can't do anything about that. You know, one of the great things about controlling the mic is that I get to ask a question or two. And so let me start, Joni. You know, I hear about this, you know, the Army CIO G6. I hear about the U.S. Cyber Command. I hear about Army Cyber Command. I hear about cyber this, cyber that. Yeah, and frankly, it is a little confusing for most of us. Help us understand, you know, how is the military organized to deal with this cyber domain thing?
Yeah, that's a great question, General Jones. And so you all have heard of NSA, right? National Security Agency, right? And the NSA, you know, they might be listening to you today, but generally, you know, their business is to, you know, listen in and do intelligence gathering, right? But it's a great foundation for what emerged as the Cyber Command. So you've heard of the Special Operations Command. They do special operations stuff. You may have heard of Transportation Command. They move all military stuff around the world. That's a functional command. And well, you know, most recently this past year, Cyber Command became a combatant command, a 4-star combatant command led by General Nakasone. And with that comes responsibility of providing the responsibility of securing the military's networks around the world operationally. Now, each of the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Marines, have their own service portion of a Cyber Command piece. So the Army has the Army Cyber Command, and it reports to the big Cyber Command 4-star. So we have a 3-star Army Cyber Command, R-Cyber, we call it for short, and it reports to Cyber Command, the 4-star command. And the Army Cyber Command is responsible operationally for all of the Army's networks. The CIO, the Chief Information Office, where I work, we are responsible for the policy, resource, and oversight to ensure Army Cyber has what it needs to be able to defend the networks. Now, we can go from there, but that's kind of the start in terms of, at a high level, how the Army is organized.
Right. That's great. Well, thanks for that. I think I'm more clear. You know, it's one of the interesting things about this domain, for me at least, is that traditionally the military is kind of on the cutting edge of technology. That when it comes, I mean, to aircraft carriers, ships, airplanes, you know, all this stuff, all the way back to GPS and all that, the military is on the cutting edge. But given the normal acquisition timeline of buying anything, you know, we're now in a position where in this domain, it's really hard to be out in front of that technological wave, and really the government, the military is behind industry. So help us understand when you have that dilemma, how do you work with industry to try to get what they're developing and get it integrated as you try to protect our networks?
It's a pretty complicated question there. So to begin with, this domain, cyberspace, is a man-made domain, right? So traditionally in the military, we talk about airspace and sea, air, sea, and land, kind of what nature gave to us, as domains. And then we created this new network and called it cyberspace, which is a man-made domain, and it's changing every single day. And so the only way that the military can keep up with that is to partner with industry. And if you look at all the tools that the Army uses or the services use, they are all, for the most part, 90+% commercial off-the-shelf capabilities that we've bought with through the industry or partner with industry to build for us. And so it's a industry-heavy situation that we're in.
Great. Now, I know some of you have some questions. We'll get to those in a minute. But I'd like to transition for a second before we open to audience questions to Dr. Choucri and ask you to make a few comments about how cyber content is presenting issues, especially the effects that it is and it can have on international relations and how global powers deal with each other.
That's an interesting issue. When we talk about content, we have to remember that we're taking content out of the communication chain. So we have to remember that we're talking about who said or sent what to whom, how, why, without, and with what effects. But by the time we've answered all these questions, we know a lot about the content. But we don't have time to ask all these questions and answer them. So the geopolitical, geostrategic situation gives us a first cut into it. And I'm talking about the civilian sector, not the military. And in that context, we have some dilemmas or some things we have to deal with. For example, about 90% of all internet communications goes through undersea cables, undersea networks. Interesting areas, because this is an arena where friends, foes, and sharks all operate on the same habitat. And then we have newcomers like Google, other part of the private sector. And some of this habitat is managed by different international conventions. And so far, I haven't used the word security. Add security to this, you've got really a big set of factors that govern 90% of internet connection. And now we want transportation, and now we want to talk about content. So let's focus on content. What do we know about content? We know one very important thing is the diversity of language. 5 years ago, English was still dominant. Now English still is, but very, very small advance. Every language under the sun is communicating with everybody else, and it's very difficult to keep track of the validity or the value, whatever it is, of the content. And unfortunately, what happens is that the burden is on you and me and our colleagues to be a little bit more careful about not only what they believe and what they read, but what websites or what emails they actually open. So it's putting a lot of burden. The content matter is putting a lot of burden on us. This is content just worrying about whether the content itself carries damaging tools that could affect us. So leaving aside the meaning of the content, we're very concerned about the various forms of damages that come to those of us that are very naive about this, and myself included. Daily, I get messages signed by MIT administration for me to do this, do this, do this. Turns out it's not MIT at all. So that's one more, and that 1,000 faculty members. So one more thing to worry about. So there's bad news and there's good news. Let me start with the bad news. The bad news is that the threats and the manipulation of content and the damages that could be carried via content is growing much faster, as you know, than our ability to get a handle on it. The good news is that we're now being able to recognize the many aspects, dimensions of content. It's no longer spaghetti plate, but we can sort it out into something of a pizza. And that's the first step into understanding whether we're looking at something that's going to alter our own message or alter our own machines, whether they're trying to extract or to replace, and so on. So we have those categories now that you may not think is very important, but it's very, very, very important, because it's one step to the use of bad news and convert that into good news by getting a sense of what the profiles are and applying what is now almost normal technology, which is machine learning or visions of AI and so forth. So it's not that we can solve the problem, it is that we can be a little bit more careful about understanding what is specifically content related and what carries damages via content, and what is just lunatic communication, of which there is really a lot. I have one more comment to make. Generally, you mentioned NSA. I'd like to put a plug for the DoD program called Cybersecurity that is in collaboration or supported by, I don't know what the mechanics are, of NSA. But what is being done here is to facilitate, help accelerate taking all the spaghetti stuff and developing tools that could help us make more sense of it. And I never thought I'd be in a position to say very supportive stuff about technological development, information, blah, 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 that comes from anywhere other than MIT. But in this case, I have to admit that. So that's as far as I can go.
Great, thank you. And you know, Dr. Choucri, you make a great point about individual responsibility is part of this equation, which is, I mean, that's a whole nother discussion about how we become more responsible users and consumers of this kind of information. One question I would have is, you know, for this challenge, are there any policy options available to countries to deal with all of this deceptive practice, fake, manipulative content, and so forth? You know, is there anything available that countries can do about that?
Yes and no, of course. So on the no part, different countries have different definitions. What is cybersecurity, what is threat, etc. In fact, I was very surprised to see the variation. But the core of this is that there seems to be a sense of there are institutions in place and mechanisms in place that are not being used that could be leveraged for coordination on content. But as far as we can, this is as far as we can go, because then there are issues of not so much privacy, but national security embedded in the content. This is off topic, but it's really quite important. And that is, there are mechanisms already in place that if they were just hardened a little bit, would help us all of us. Legitimate mechanisms. For example, the certificate authorities that certify your legitimacy and as a user of the internet. Imagine if they were really, really operative, as opposed to just not so operative or not operative at all. At least we'd have a better sense of not so much identity, but somebody's watching over the source of the communication. My sense is that if there is going to be a serious attempt to deal with and manage toxic content, it'll have to be private-public collaboration, but it would also have to be democratized, not centralized, but decentralized. And the difficulty there is how to combine distributive activities with some kind of a screening mechanisms to see what's good and what's bad. So ultimately, you're left to your own devices and to do the best you can in the civilian, in civil society. Going back to this morning's first session on the TSA, when you go through the line, it's expected that you would have only one identity. If the officer finds that you have 2 or 3 maybe hidden identities in their computers and that's not on yours, you would probably be questioned. Okay? On the internet, you can have multiple identities, multiple identities, and nobody really raises a question. So the question is, can anything be done about it? My colleagues say that if we put identity aside for just a moment and we make better use of the ISPs that we have, get them a little bit more responsible in terms of not controlling, and I don't even want to say observing what's going through, but more alert and aware of what it is that they're carrying, perhaps would be better off. This is not a good answer. It's no answer, but it's the reality.
Well, I mean, you've really, you've alluded to an issue that I'm going to kind of put you on the spot on. And it really goes back to the very first question we were asked today, and that is, we do have a tension between, on one hand, can we have an uncontrolled environment, or do we have to somehow institute controls that protect the environment and content and so forth, with a very legitimate value that we hold dearly, and that is the freedom of expression. And so there's this tension between those two things. So, is there a possibility of achieving a balance between those two, or are we left to a world of where we just have to have this information free-for-all and just sort through it as we go? What are your thoughts?
In some way, we don't have an information free-for-all. We do have some controls. Child pornography, for example, is not, can we add to this pile things that are offensive but in a different domain? So I don't think it's the openness. I think what you may really be asking is, can we get the results that China is getting without having to go through the route that China is doing through its social credit system and through its really control of its own network?
Right.
And the answer is yes, because our networks are controlled by or run by private sector.
Okay. With that, what I want to do is I want to transition, since I know there are probably a few questions out there. So if the folks with the mics can come on down, and if you have a question, please raise your hand. I do want to make one reminder. A question usually includes an interrogative sentence. So I know you may have to make a statement to provide some context, but we would appreciate it if it would include an interrogative sentence. And if you have a specific person you want to direct it to, please let us know. So I thought I saw some hands over here. Here's one right here. Yes, sir. Right, go ahead and stand up, and somebody will bring a mic to you.
Good morning. I'm Michael Sisti. I'm an Air Force ROTC cadet at Yale University. I'm looking to go into cyber operations, and so I was wondering, for the general, as cyber becomes more of a warfighting domain, how do you see us building our doctrine, seeing how that is such a really underutilized domain where the strategy hasn't really been developed for that? And how does that then connect back to our broader issues of just network security and business as normal, status quo, secure communications?
Thanks for starting us off with an easy question, by the way.
Kind of a broad question there. Let me just share with you what we are doing today. And so back to that cyber command, right? And within cyber command, we have a number of cyber mission forces, right? The Army has like 1,700, personnel assigned with these special, the special designation as part of the cyber mission forces. Those are broken down into teams, team leads with offense and defensive cyber operations capabilities. And that doctrine is evolving as we learn to fight in this domain. And we do have authorities do exist to conduct offensive cyber operations. Whether we use those or not is a different story, but those authorities do exist. They're retained at the highest level for national security purposes. But every single day, I kid you not, our cyber operators are on the network fighting on that domain. And as we learn through what we do, that doctrine does evolve. Now, the doctrine is joint, so whether Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, they're joining it, it's the same in how we fight. Some may recall maybe in 2014, the ISIS crisis, you might want to call it that. And I was in Kuwait at the time, just arrived. And at the time, you may have seen videos on television, people in orange jumpsuits, very disturbing, things happening all over social media, right? And for some reason, we didn't seem like we can get ahead of it. And every day there was something new and disturbing. You don't see that anymore, do you? Right? So it's not to say that, there are things that we can't do, there are things that we can do. And we do more than just dropping bombs on places. And so we are fighting on that network every single day.
Great. Thanks very much. And I appreciate, last weekend I was at my alma mater, Carson Newman University, and one of the ROTC cadets, I told him what I was doing this weekend, and he made a shameless appeal to me because he wants to also be in the commission in Cyber Force to ask for General Yee's intercession. So thank you for not being quite so shameless, but but good luck to you. It is funny how many people are in the Army that are cadets are vying to get into this because they know how important it is. Yes, sir, right here. This gentleman right behind you. We can hear it if you'll talk into it.
My question is addressed to Dr. Nazli. This is kind of an academic question. Things that you talk about cybersecurity. Now, what are the parameters? What are the metrics that you find useful for cybersecurity? And things that we all in this situation, you have got to model systems. You've got to simulate systems. And what kinds of situations are you able to model, say, in the field of international relations? You call it cyber international.
That is a terrific question, and it's I have an easy answer. I don't know how many of you spend your time looking at the NIST reports, and how many of you put them together and appreciate what NIST is producing in terms of implicit models of security for various industries, etc. And then, excuse me, and the very clear directives that they give, and so forth. And so that is an immense source of research already done that's right there. Now that's one part. Part two is that it's all in text. Word after word, page after page, etc., 3,000 pages, very interesting, very important, except that text does not make it possible for us to understand feedback in what they're suggesting as policy responses, or delays, or whatever. So we are handicapping ourselves by virtue of the fact that we operate with text. And there's no alternative, except to try to transform text into a structured model of policy, and then look at the structured model of policy as if it were, render it into a network view of policy. The content is policy. And the reason this is important is that you can't expect anybody under the sun to spend time and effort reading and extracting, value to them or to their own industry from the voluminous and very important material that NIST is doing. So back again to the NSA's and DoD's science of security, developing tools to just make it possible for you to understand what the policy implications are of that policy without thinking about implementations yet, I think in itself is very, very important.
Right. I thought, way in the back over here, are you the spokesperson for that group?
Different girl, sorry. Hi, my name is second class Delaney Swift, and I'm with the U.S. Coast Guard Academy Cyber Team. And I had a question for whoever. In traditional deterrence theory, mutually assured destruction is effective because nuclear weapons...
Could you hold that mic slightly more to your mouth? So
Oh,
we
yes,
can
sir.
hear?
Sorry. In traditional deterrence theory, mutually assured destruction is effective because nuclear weapons are attributable, attack the same surface area, and require state sponsorship to manufacture. In cyber warfare, the prospect of mutually assured destruction changes because digital weapons can be manufactured at low cost by unitary actors without a definitive signature, and they do not affect all nations with the same level of destruction. How do you think that these realities will change the way the U.S. uses deterrence theory in the global conflict?
Interesting question.
Well, so I'll start, and maybe Dr. Choucri can add to it. So one of the challenges, within the cyberspace domain, if you want to call it a domain, is attribution. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy to have unattributable actions on the internet or on the network. And so you may think, a nation state did something and it may not be, right? Which is why when we conduct offensive cyber operations, we're careful when we release those authorities to Cybercom or below. Not just because we may not know who it is, but also when we use some of the tools, we then potentially expose a source, or we expose how we do something. And so we're very careful about when we use some of the techniques in cyberspace. So very careful about that. But Dr. Choucri?
I just want to add that this is a case where the old days were really much better, excuse me, than now. Good guys, bad guys, we knew something was coming our way, probably comes from the bad guys, not from good. Now, the distribution of potential sources of harm makes it very difficult to apply deterrence theory as it was. And so there's an effort to try to see if it can be adapted, expanded, etc. My colleagues in computer science tell me, and I have no way of verifying that, that it's just a matter of time until we can trace back to some signature. But to me, that's too vague. Given the fact that we have already in place mechanisms like Tor, the onion router that you're familiar with, that goes out of its way to make sure that your privacy and you as a source of damage will be protected. So,
but it's a very good question, because today, as we speak, it's maybe not in a mutual assured destruction context. It's about what do you do about it when you believe someone did something to you, maybe not at huge scale, but let's say maybe something in the election, maybe something in espionage, maybe something in your own networks that Yeah. And so it may not be, assured mutual destruction, but how do you respond without creating an escalation, right?
and what you would hope for is to be able to develop a global strategy of mutually assured deterrence. But we don't know what the algorithms would look like and so forth. But at least there's something to look forward to.
And that's a great topic. And Megan, when that Washington Post op-ed was? Wednesday. Okay. I commend to you to go to the Washington Post last Wednesday and look for an op-ed piece. And I can't remember the title of it. I think it was something about an attack on our infrastructure would be devastating, or something very similar to that. But just so happens that one of the leaders here in the Connecticut World Affairs Council also wears a hat as the chief of cybersecurity for the state of Connecticut, and did an op-ed piece that talked about this problem, and that is, given our vulnerabilities, do you really want to get into some sort of tit-for-tat attack back and forth with each other, and what the consequences might be? So thank you for that question. That's I was kind of hoping that would come up. Yes, ma'am. Right here.
Thank you.
I think it's on if you'll.
Okay. My name is Irina Naumova, and I'm a business professor. And I want to attract your attention to the problem that businesses now have. Yes, globalization is a condition of our life. Yes, you're absolutely right. But I guess cyberspace has several different layers, I would say, of threats. It could be on national level, regional level, well, on our personal level, of course, and on companies level. And this one on companies is the new one. And companies actually do not know how to react on it because, well, in business, we always look for the signals from market. And now we have so many fake news, and market is actually not what it was before. We do not know what's that because of the fake that is covering it now. So companies definitely do not know how to deal with it. Any suggestions?
She was looking at you.
I can just refer to what is being done in the MIT Sloan School, which is trying to develop, I hate to use the word educate, but yes, educate the private sector in terms of the functions that have to be performed at their end to secure their own networks to begin with, before worrying about signals from the market. Because the damage to individual companies accelerating much faster than the willingness to even think about doing. The incentive is to respond to market conditions. And the Sloan School's view is, of course you have to respond to market conditions, but take care of your own house immediately now. And you can do it by doing A, B, C, D, and E. And that's fairly developed.
Great. Yes, sir, right here.
My name's Dave Norris. Thank you all. Acquiring the expertise to deal
again,
with
a little closer.
acquiring the expertise to deal with cybersecurity must be an issue. We've had some issues with contractors in the past. Could you please address, this is the interrogative, could you please address how you go about this and can you keep up?
So I think that's a Department of Defense type question or a federal government type question. It has been a problem. And so OMB, which has responsibility for part of that, had a breach a couple years ago. And everyone's, data was put out there. John Jones's data is probably out there as well. And so the insider threat, is what I think you're referring to. Someone from the inside that has access that shouldn't have access. And so the underlying, area is the identity, credential, and access management. Kind of like the certificate piece that you were talking about, Dr. Choucri, but for within the DoD, this is a very important area for us to make sure we know who's on the network and that you have a, one persona and you are a cleared person to have access to that data. Relook in the contract, relook in how we do the background checks is an evolving effort as we speak today. And it's not probably where it needs to be. It's better than it was when we had that breach a couple years ago. And my sense is that over time it has to continue to improve upon how it validates who's on the network. So it's not only in terms of contractors, but it's also the supply chain piece that we talked about as well. So there's two ways into the insider threat, one of which is a wrong person on the network, and the other is getting some sort of code through some sort of supply chain that comes into the DoD.
Great. Yes, sir. You've been very patient. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. As the network moved from the
Again, mic close to the mouth, please.
Centralized, Jason Liu. I've been involved with network design technology all my life. As the General Jones mentioned, how the DARPANET was born. As the network moving from a centralized circuit switched network to a packet switched open system, you lack of this capability to monitor and from the originating node to the destination node without the ability to monitor the total chain. Does that hamper the ability to protect the network security, despite the ability to decipher the contents on a link-by-link level?
Yeah. So it's a semi-technical question that I'll try to answer semi-technically. Yeah. What you're referring to when General Jones kind of did the intro was that the internet was made based upon trust. And so if you use TCP/IP, it's connect and then validate who's on the network, right? You connect first and then you validate, as opposed to let's validate who's on the other end before making the connection. So the internet is inherently unsafe or unsecure and open, right? I think that's what you're referring to. And so when you don't have that ability to know who is at the distant end, how do you ensure you have good security? So for a long time, businesses and the military spent a lot of resources on trying to secure access points, right? Through secure routers and switches, and through firewalls, right? Which is not necessarily, getting after the underlying issue, which is it's an open architecture, right? And so the focus then has to be on ensuring that the data that you have is encrypted and secure, and so regardless of who has access to it, they can't do anything with it once they see it, because they really can't see it. So therein lies kind of the shift in focus over the last couple of years in protecting the data, more so than just the transmission port.
Great. And I appreciate it. Thanks for that answer. And if I could ask for some help, if one of our high school students at the break could explain to me what that question was, and maybe the answer, I'd really appreciate it. Yes, sir, here in the back.
We're around the back.
Hello, my name is David Eisenthal. I work for a bank, and I will say that the financial world has woken up to the threat. I have to take training, and I'm not a cyber professional myself, but I have to take training on phishing and social engineering and other such issues. And as I take such training, I kind of wonder, to what degree is there any sense among the professionals how many of these cyber attacks come from overseas, from foreign sources? How many of them are state actors versus non-state actors? How much of it is domestic? And then I guess I also wonder, to what degree are resources of the DoD being devoted, and to the extent you can talk about it, in what way can they be devoted to countering these actors that may be foreign sources? Thank you.
Great.
So you've made a couple of, you had a couple of embedded questions in that statement. And so let me just start by just providing a few thoughts. Yes, the DoD does spend a lot on protecting the perimeter so that intrusions can't come in. Once they come through the perimeter, there's a series of security stacks that we have. So we have, security enclaves that traffic goes through after they come into the perimeter, and then protecting the data. And so those are ongoing efforts every single day to protect against whether criminals or state actors, right? And if the question is, how much is state versus criminal, it's hard to say because the traffic that comes into us is just a series of scans and things just pinging the network. So it could be, state actor, could be criminal. Most of the stuff that I think that the military is concerned with is probably state actors, all right? There's no secret about that because there's interest in what we're doing in terms of our strategy, et cetera. So state actors in particular, also interested in our plans and how we build things, right? So it's kind of a espionage type thing as well, not just the government, but subcontractors to the government. So that's obviously an area, and it's an area that we're concerned about, uncleared contractors that we talked about earlier. So that's kind of the flavor of what happens to us in our world.
Yeah, I want to add one comment to that. In my work with industry. First of all, I'll tell you, although not sure how you feel about it, but my estimate is probably the banking industry of all the industries is probably the best at this, and there are a whole lot of others that really have a lot of catching up to do. In terms of the percentages, I don't think, because in many cases it's hard to identify where something's coming from. I couldn't imagine what the distribution is of state, non-state criminal, people who do this for fun. I mean, it's kind of all the above. There is actually a book I'd recommend folks read that are interested in this. I think it's called Future Crime. I think the subtitle is something like "Everything is Connected and Everything is Vulnerable." But it's a great book that starts to give you an image of some of these challenges, of all of these attacks that are going on, and the frequency is mind-boggling. It's just continuous. So that's a great question. And if you are in industry, if you're in a small business, a large business, whatever it is, it's all affecting you, and don't be surprised, although you may think that, hey, I'm a small business, nobody would care about me. If you're connected, you can be a point of entree for folks who want to get after who you're connected with. So really great question. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
My name is
No, is that on?
My name is Vercelia Oliphant, and my question is for Major General Yi. Prior to 9/11, I don't think we envisioned anything like that ever happening. And so my question is, being that the military relies so much on the cyber communications, do we ever envision any way that it could be compromised to the point that it's not used, or you can't use it, it can't be used? And if so, I'm hoping it's somewhat hypothetical. If it can't be used, do we have anything, a backup system? Do we have anything comparable to what we have for communications? Do we revert to like a Paul Revere, horse and rider? But do we have
Smoke
anything?
signals, hand and arm signals. Yes, we plan for it. We plan for it every day. We plan that we expect that, in a future fight, or even in a current fight, there are times when we don't have access to, you name it, satellite communications or landline communications. And so we do plan for it. I know the other services plan for it as well. And so, the Army has undertaken this huge, review of the network. It's one of the priorities that we talked about modernizing. It's threat informed. It was informed by what happened in the Ukraine a couple years ago, where they were spoofed. All the folks on the battlefield were spoofed into thinking that they were secure. They weren't secure, and they were taken out in no time at all. And so, we realize that our communications are jammable, they're vulnerable, and we have to prepare to fight without those like we did before we had all that good stuff. Good question.
Great. Way in the back here, almost behind the screen.
Hi guys, my name is Fawad Farid. I'm a filmmaker. My question is really, it's about the content. We're talking about advancement in technologies and what have we achieved and will continue to achieve. But our enemies are using a lot more simple technologies and really like content that are somewhat disturbing. But what are we doing to counter that? Because they are very effective in like recruiting, such as like ISIS in Europe. And what are we doing to counter that? And not just by trying to limit services like Twitter's or Facebook, and what's our strategy there? Thank you.
Well, let me put it this way.
I'm going to add on that also, but go ahead.
What I was thinking was that we are making it but easier for various adversaries by virtue of the fact that we contribute to knowledge that is available in Facebook that makes us in civil society sitting ducks. And imagine a world without Facebook and a world with Facebook. add to that our apparent lack of concern about privacy when we're involved in Facebook, and then we're concerned about national security versus a dominant control system. So we're in the middle of lots of contradictions. Now, the point of all this is that we are the only generation ever, and there won't be any other one, that knew a world before the internet and cyberspace and after the internet and cyberspace. Not only that, but we are the ones who are trying to put in place a set of mechanisms that will help guide, our students, future generations, etc. So in a way, there's a response. Every time we answer a question, there is or ask a question, there is a serious responsibility there. That's why the old days were so much easier and so much more pleasant.
Yeah. And you've really gone back to our first panel, and that is you're highlighting what I would call a dilemma. And of course, the dilemma is that we highly value freedom of expression. We do not trust our government to internally inside our country control our information. There's all these dynamics, but at the same time, we certainly have a lot of enemies who want to use this value that we have to try to turn it into a vulnerability. And so I think the answer to that is there really is no answer, that there's going to be a tension between what's the right responsibility of the government, what's the responsibility of the private sector, which I think is a great point of emphasis, and that is we have the private sector that has capability to help solve this problem, and then what is just going to be the open commons, where we say because we value the freedom of expression so much, we're going to accept a certain level of risk and then try to deal with the consequences. But I wish there was an answer to that question. I'm not sure that there is one.
I got a good book for you to read, though, if you haven't already read it. Thank You for Being Late by Tom Friedman.
Right.
Talks about technology, and in 2007, the iPhone, was born, and the world's been changed since. But one of the underlying themes is it takes humans time to adapt to change, and society to adapt to those changes from a governance standpoint. And so if you use cars, for example, it took a while for us to come up with laws and rules, how to drive safely and navigate. And humans were able to adapt to that naturally because that took some time. We feel sometimes a little overwhelmed with all this technology because the acceleration of change just increases. And so you feel like you can't keep up with it. And that's kind of what's happening today.
Can I just add to this?
Yeah, please do.
On top of it all, we really don't want our regulatory systems or our laws to change at cyberspeed. We really want the laws to be more or less relevant to society and not to carry the uncertainties associated with near instantaneity.
Great. Okay, I think I have time for one more question, sir, right here. Why don't we?
My name is Jim Sutton, UTC, United Technologies, thankfully retired. My question really is dealing with artificial intelligence. And how do you plan to utilize artificial intelligence both for offensive and defensive cybersecurity?
Well, the answer and then maybe you could contribute. The answer is absolutely, yes. We plan to use it for all kinds of stuff. And so maybe you've read in the news, maybe not, but about a couple months ago, the Department of Defense stood up the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, right, for the DoD. And the idea isn't that one little nucleus will take care of it for all of the department. It's kind of the umbrella organization. And within the Army, we have stood up a artificial intelligence task force led by a one-star general who's got a PhD focused on AI. And within the Army, we have 4 or 5 different big data efforts underway, leading to, at some point, an artificial intelligence capability, not just on the network, not just on cyberspace operations, but things like logistics, things like, personnel systems. There's a number of applications for artificial intelligence. One of which, though, is, for cybersecurity, cyberspace operations. Remember, the military, for us, it's about lethality. Everything we do is about winning on the battlefield. Everything we do has to go to that pointy end of the spear. And so you bet, we will utilize what we can for artificial intelligence to make our soldiers more lethal, to ensure that our weapon systems are capable when we need them to be capable, that our aerial platforms are reliable, et cetera. So, great question, very timely.
Just to follow up on this, in the other side of the world, civil society, et cetera, there's been some initiatives, Harvard, MIT, pre initiatives to think about AI for governance and for government, presumably more efficiency, blah, 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 blah. The other side of this is attention to the ethics, the ethical boundaries and the ethical underpinnings that begin to bound what we're willing to use AI for in civil society.
That's great. Now I apologize up front that I know we have questions we go on for 3 more hours, but I want to give our panelists a few minutes in order to sum up a couple key points that we all ought to be walking away with from their perspective. So, Dr. Choucri, any closing comments?
Yeah, I have one closing comment, and that is next time you read a policy document that's 600 pages, please think of me and the DoD Science of Security project, and you might want to find out how to transform your 600 pages into 1 page that is a structured model. Might help.
Thank you.
I want to thank the World Affairs Council and all the sponsors for bringing this together today. It's important for us to talk about this stuff, right? I like the idea here that it's a mix of the community here in Connecticut. It's a little bit of a cross-section of maybe the area here where we can talk about this stuff in a forum, kind of open exchange, and share some ideas. We don't have the answers to everything, obviously, but it's important to talk about it to raise awareness about what's happening, and so that we're a better informed society. You by doing your part by participating in this forum, and I, enjoy the opportunity. So thank you.
Well, thanks, and for all of you, you're about ready to get a very well-deserved break. We're going to take time for lunch, and I believe out in the foyer where we had the snacks and so forth ahead of time. We're going to start again at 1:30, so please enjoy your lunch period, continue the dialogue. But please be back at 1:30. We have a lot more interesting dialogue and discussion to have. And please join me in thanking our panelists once again. Appreciate it.
I understand your question, and the answer is it depends.
No.
Mm-hmm.